The craziest thing about this story isn't that an HOA blocked my wheelchair access for months, and it isn't even that I lost the biggest job opportunity of my career because of it. The craziest thing is that the person who eventually brought the whole thing crashing down happened to live right next door. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 39 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked as a civil design specialist in a quiet suburban community outside Tucson, Arizona. I've always been the kind of guy who keeps his head down, pays his dues, follows the rules, and avoids drama whenever possible. Maybe that's why what happened caught me completely off guard. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home after meeting with a client and immediately noticed bright orange barricades stretching across the only wheelchair-accessible pathway connecting my front porch to the driveway. At first, I thought it was some temporary construction issue, maybe a utility repair or landscaping project. Then I rolled closer and realized the entire access route had been buried beneath piles of gravel, lumber, broken concrete, and construction waste. The debris wasn't just blocking the path, it completely eliminated it. There was no alternate route, no temporary ramp, no accommodation of any kind. My van sat 30 feet away in the driveway, practically mocking me. I could see it, but I couldn't reach it. I remember staring at that ridiculous pile of junk and laughing because the situation seemed too stupid to be real. Surely someone had made a mistake. Surely someone would fix it tomorrow. Except tomorrow came and nothing changed. Then the next day came. Then another. What made the timing especially brutal was that I was in the final stages of interviewing for a senior infrastructure management position with a private engineering firm. The salary was just over $90,000 a year, nearly $20,000 more than I was making at the time. 3 interviews remained. 3 opportunities to completely change my financial future. The first interview required an in-person visit. I called the company, explained the situation, and they graciously rescheduled. Then I called the HOA office. The property manager answered with the kind of voice that sounded annoyed before the conversation even started. I explained that my wheelchair access had been blocked and asked when the construction materials would be removed. She didn't apologize. She didn't sound concerned. She simply said, temporary maintenance project. Estimated completion, 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. I honestly thought I had heard her wrong. I asked how they expected a wheelchair user to leave his home during that time. There was silence. Then she said, those are the scheduled repairs. I explained that I had important job interviews. More silence. I explained that the blockage prevented me from accessing transportation. More silence. Finally, she interrupted me mid-sentence and said something I'll never forget. We don't make special exceptions for emotional stories. Then she hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, wondering whether I had actually imagined the conversation. Over the next 2 weeks, nothing improved. No workers appeared. No progress was made. The debris remained exactly where it had been. I missed the first interview, then the second. By the 3rd week, the company informed me they had selected another candidate. The hiring manager sounded genuinely sympathetic when she called. She even said she hoped we could reconnect in the future. I thanked her, hung up, and just sat there in silence. It wasn't only about the money. It was about realizing that somebody else's carelessness had stolen an opportunity one had spent years working toward. That's the part people don't always understand. Sometimes the biggest damage isn't financial. Sometimes it's watching a future disappear while you're powerless to stop it. A few days later, I was sitting on my porch, looking out the blocked pathway for what felt like the 1,000th time, when I noticed my neighbor across the hedge. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, retired appellate judge, smart, respected, and probably the last person the HOA would ever want paying attention to their behavior. As I watched her tending flowers near the property line, an old memory suddenly came rushing back. 4 years earlier, before her retirement, she had been dealing with severe structural issues beneath her home. Multiple contractors told her the foundation damage was beyond practical repair. The estimates were astronomical. The legal disputes were even worse. Back then, I volunteered my expertise, spent weeks reviewing plans, and developed a solution that saved her a fortune. I never charged a dime. I just wanted to help a neighbor. When the project was finally completed, she looked me in the eye and said something that seemed insignificant at the time. Ethan, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Sitting there trapped on my own porch, staring at the construction debris that had already cost me a career-changing opportunity, I found myself wondering whether she even remembered saying those words. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I want to pause for a second because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how situations like this spiral out of control. According to standard procedure, when construction or maintenance affects accessibility, especially for residents with mobility limitations, organizations are generally expected to provide a reasonable alternative route or accommodation. That isn't some extraordinary favor, it's basic risk management. From a legal perspective, the moment someone knowingly creates a barrier that prevents access and then ignores repeated complaints, they're stepping into very dangerous territory. But here's the part that fascinates me most. This is a psychological trap that power structures fall into all the time. The HOA board had gotten so used to residents backing down that they stopped evaluating consequences. Every complaint looked the same to them. Every homeowner became just another file number. Once people start believing they're untouchable, they stop asking whether they're right and start assuming they'll win no matter what. The lesson here is simple. Most disasters don't begin with a major act of corruption. They begin with a small decision, repeated over and over, by people who think nobody important is paying attention. In my case, somebody important was about to start paying very close attention. The next evening I was sitting outside again because, honestly, there wasn't much else I could do. When your world shrinks to the size of your front porch, you start noticing things you'd normally ignore. The sound of sprinklers, the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses down, the way the sun reflected off parked cars at sunset. I remember hearing footsteps on the sidewalk and looking up to see Margaret Whitmore walking toward me, carrying a small watering can. She stopped, looked at the mountain of debris blocking my access route, then looked back at me. "Ethan," she said quietly, "how long has that been there?" I told her everything. Not the shortened version. Everything. The blocked pathway. The missed interviews. The conversations with the HOA. The job offer that disappeared. The property manager's comment about emotional stories. The longer I talked, the more her expression changed. She wasn't angry in the dramatic movie sense. She became something much more dangerous. Focused. Controlled. The kind of calm that usually means someone has already started planning. When I finally finished, she folded her arms and asked one question. "Do you have documentation?" I almost laughed. I was an engineer. Documentation was practically my religion. I rolled back inside and returned with folders containing photographs, emails, maintenance notices, county records, timeline logs, recorded phone summaries, and my own technical assessment explaining exactly how the obstruction eliminated safe access to the property. Margaret accepted the stack without saying much. Before leaving, she simply said, "I'll review everything tonight." The following morning, there was a knock on my door shortly after 8. I opened it and found Margaret standing there holding a thick legal folder. She stepped inside, placed the folder on the kitchen table, and said, "I've gone through all of it." Then she looked directly at me. "This is worse than I expected." She explained that the evidence suggested the HOA had not only ignored repeated warnings, but had knowingly maintained an unnecessary obstruction despite being fully aware of the consequences. More importantly, their written correspondence showed a pattern of dismissive conduct that made their position difficult to defend. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I'm helping you personally." For a moment, I thought I misunderstood. She had been retired for years. She didn't need this fight. She certainly didn't need the stress. Yet there she was organizing paperwork like she was preparing for a major appellate hearing. We spent hours reviewing records, building timelines, identifying inconsistencies, and preparing formal complaints. Every photograph was labeled. Every communication was indexed. Every statement was cross-referenced. Watching her work reminded me why she had earned such a formidable reputation in the first place. 3 days later, emergency filings were submitted. The HOA board still didn't seem concerned. According to a resident who attended one of their meetings, several board members joked that I was exaggerating. One even allegedly suggested that I was looking for a payout. That attitude lasted right up until the first hearing. The hearing itself wasn't dramatic at first. The HOA attorney arrived looking relaxed. Several board members appeared confident. One director even smiled while talking with another resident outside the courtroom. Then proceedings began. Margaret presented the timeline. She presented photographs. She presented correspondence. She presented maintenance schedules showing almost no meaningful work had been performed during large portions of the obstruction period. Then she introduced something I hadn't even known she was investigating: county permit records. As it turned out, several construction activities associated with the project appeared inconsistent with approved documentation. Suddenly, the conversation shifted. What had started as an accessibility dispute became a broader compliance discussion. The HOA attorney's confidence began evaporating in real time. You could see it happening. Questions became shorter. Answers became slower. The judge requested additional documentation. Then came a moment everything changed. Rather than focusing solely on my complaint, the court ordered a comprehensive review of multiple HOA-managed projects and compliance practices. The board members looked stunned. They had expected a narrow dispute. Instead, they had invited scrutiny into years of questionable decisions. Over the following weeks, county inspectors started appearing throughout the neighborhood. At first, residents assumed it was routine. Then inspection notices began showing up. Then violation reports followed. Structures built without proper authorization. Retaining walls extending beyond approved boundaries. Drainage modifications creating runoff concerns. Utility easement encroachments. Safety deficiencies. Missing permits. Incomplete inspections. The list kept growing. Every few days, another report surfaced. Every week, the situation became worse. The most unbelievable discovery involved the HOA president himself. For years, he had aggressively enforced minor violations against homeowners. Grass length, fence paint, decorative lighting, mailbox colors. Yet inspectors discovered that his own oversized garage expansion partially interfered with a protected drainage easement. The irony was almost too perfect. Residents couldn't stop talking about it. Some laughed. Some were furious. Most were simply shocked. The board that constantly lectured everyone else about compliance suddenly found itself explaining why it hadn't followed the same standards. Financial penalties followed quickly. Violation notices carried daily assessments. Legal expenses skyrocketed. Consultants were hired. Engineers were retained. Corrective work became mandatory. Insurance carriers began reviewing claims. Then came another devastating blow. Coverage disputes emerged. Certain costs appeared unlikely to qualify for reimbursement. The HOA's reserve funds started shrinking at an alarming rate. Residents demanded answers. Special meetings became chaotic. Homeowners who had spent years quietly accepting board decisions suddenly began speaking up. Some demanded resignations. Others requested audits. One resident reportedly stood up during a meeting and asked why the board had spent months fighting a disabled homeowner instead of spending a single afternoon clearing a pathway. Nobody had a good answer. As public pressure intensified, internal divisions appeared within the board itself. Members started blaming one another. Emails surfaced. Meeting records were questioned. Decisions that once seemed routine now looked reckless under examination. The property manager who had dismissed my concerns suddenly found herself answering difficult questions about communication practices and decision-making authority. Meanwhile, the obstruction that had trapped me for months disappeared almost overnight. Workers arrived. Equipment arrived. Debris vanished. Temporary accommodations appeared. Safety barriers were installed correctly. Funny how quickly solutions become possible once accountability enters the picture. Yet by then the issue had grown far beyond my driveway. The investigation had developed its own momentum. Inspectors continued working. Additional findings continued emerging. Costs continued rising. Eventually, several board representatives reached out through intermediaries expressing interest in settlement discussions. Translation: panic had officially arrived. The people who once refused to return phone calls were now desperate to negotiate. The same organization that had treated my concerns as an inconvenience was suddenly facing consequences far larger than anything they had imagined. And the most remarkable part was that none of this happened because someone powerful pulled strings. It happened because the board spent months assuming rules applied to everyone except themselves. Once that illusion collapsed, everything else started collapsing with it. By the time serious negotiations finally began, the HOA wasn't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to survive. By the time everything finally settled down, the strangest feeling wasn't victory. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't even relief. It was perspective. For months, I had convinced myself the story was about a blocked wheelchair path, a lost job opportunity, and a fight with an HOA. Looking back now, I realized those things were only the surface. The real story was about what happens when ordinary people are treated like they don't matter. A few months after the settlement was finalized, I accepted a new position with another engineering firm. Ironically, the compensation package ended up being significantly better than the opportunity one originally lost. Life has a weird sense of humor sometimes. The pathway leading from my porch to the driveway is spotless now. Wide, smooth, fully compliant, and maintained better than any access route in the neighborhood. Every time I roll down that path, I remember sitting on that same porch wondering whether anyone would ever take my situation seriously. What I learned is something I wish more homeowners understood. According to standard procedure, organizations only function properly when accountability exists. The moment accountability disappears, rules stop being safeguards and start becoming weapons. That's true for HOAs, corporations, local governments, and honestly, just about any group of people given authority over others. From a legal perspective, many conflicts become expensive not because the original problem was severe, but because decision-makers refuse to correct small mistakes when they first appear. My blocked access route could have been resolved in a single afternoon. A temporary accommodation could have been installed in a few hours. A respectful phone call could have prevented months of conflict. Instead, pride took over. Ego took over. People became more interested in defending decisions than solving problems. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere. Once someone gains authority, they sometimes start viewing compromise as weakness. Every challenge feels like an attack. Every complaint feels personal. Every request for fairness feels like disrespect. That's usually the moment bad decisions multiply. The board members didn't wake up one morning planning to create a disaster. They simply kept making increasingly poor choices because nobody inside the system was willing to admit they were wrong. The lesson here is that accountability often arrives from unexpected places. Sometimes it's a regulator. Sometimes it's a court. Sometimes it's a neighbor paying attention when everyone else looks away. In my case, it happened to be a retired judge who remembered a favor from years earlier and believed basic fairness still mattered. That's another lesson I carry with me. The good things we do for people have a way of traveling through time. When I helped Margaret years ago, I wasn't building some future alliance. I wasn't expecting repayment. I was simply helping someone who needed help. Yet years later, when I found myself trapped in a situation I couldn't solve alone, that kindness came back in a way I never could have predicted. There's something powerful about that. We spend so much time hearing stories about selfishness that we forget how often decency quietly changes lives behind the scenes. Today, whenever neighbors ask about the situation, I usually laugh and tell them the HOA spent months proving a point they never should have tested in the first place. They believed they were protecting authority. What they actually protected was a perfect record of their own mistakes. And maybe that's why this story still sticks with people. Most of us have encountered someone who believed power made them untouchable. Most of us have watched rules get enforced selectively. Most of us have experienced moments where doing the right thing would have been easier than creating conflict. Yet conflict happened anyway because somebody refused to listen. In the end, the pathway was restored, the board was forced to answer difficult questions, residents became more involved in their community, and life moved forward. Not every story ends that neatly. Not every homeowner gets justice. Not every system corrects itself. But sometimes it does. Sometimes accountability shows up. Sometimes arrogance overplays its hand. Sometimes the people being underestimated turn out to be the people who change everything. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever seen an HOA, a company, or even a local authority push things too far because they assumed nobody would challenge them? And if you had been in my position, would you have kept fighting, or would you have walked away after losing the job opportunity? Let me know down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious because stories like this always spark debate. Some people think the consequences were excessive. Others think they were completely justified. Either way, one thing is certain. The next time somebody says they don't make exceptions, they might want to make sure they're not standing one bad decision away from becoming the exception themselves.